design arguments, consider a banana. Okay, just kidding. We have Aquinas' Fifth Way.
The first thing that I want to say here is to see my video Arguments for Classical Theism, Part 1 out of 2. I give an extended critical examination of boatloads of arguments for classical theism in that video, as well as Part 2 out of 2. Now, you might ask, well, what about that 3-part series on arguments against classical theism, some of which I'm defending, but others of which I am harshly criticizing? Well, that's a work in progress. I haven't forgotten about it. I just have to do a ton of research for the next ones, including reading all up on impassibility and so on. Just give me some time. Eventually, I'll get there. But in the meantime, of course, I'm producing this sort of content. Let's just listen to Chad explain Aquinas' Fifth Way.
Aquinas' Fifth Way. Whatever has ends or goals is either intelligent or is directed by intelligence. Efficient causes in nature have ends or goals and work together towards the goal of harmony and order. 3, efficient causes in nature are not intelligent. So, efficient causes in nature are directed by intelligence.
So I will say that premise 1, just by my light, seems implausible. Suppose we are realists about biological function. So various organs have real, objective, mind-independent functions. So, for instance, maybe it's the function of the heart to pump blood or something like that. Well, the first thing to say is that that's perfectly consistent with there being no intelligence behind it. Perhaps evolutionary history is principally determinative of function. Or perhaps we have a naturalistic neo-Aristotelian view, on which the ends or goals are dictated by or follow from the essence or nature of the thing in question, with no appeal to intelligence necessary. So anyway, premise 1 just seems false to me. You could easily have ends or goals in the sense of a kind of directedness toward a specific effect that isn't due to some kind of intelligence governing it. More generally, my main problem for the argument can be cast in terms of a dilemma. By ends or goals, we either mean a mere dispositional directedness toward something, or else a sense that, like, definitionally implies some kind of intention behind them. If it's the latter, then I think premise 2 here is clearly false. No, efficient causes in nature don't have those kinds of ends or goals, and no naturalist would ever grant that. But under the first sense, I think premise 1 is then false. The mere fact that something has a disposition towards something doesn't entail that, like, there's some sort of intelligence behind it. No, just given its nature, it's disposed toward this particular effect, right? Given the nature of salt. And I can give you a chemical explanation of this. Given the nature of salt, it has a disposition to dissolve when placed in water, right? And so there's some sort of directedness toward dissolving once placed in water. So it's a kind of disposition towards that thing. This doesn't require there to be some mind behind it, or there's some intelligence that's, like, directing the salt to dissolve when it's in water. No. So anyway, I just find premise 1 at least implausible. Moreover, I find premise 2 questionable. I don't even think efficient causation implies dispositional directedness. There are lots of perfectly coherent views on which there's efficient causation, but there aren't dispositions. Secondly, efficient causation certainly doesn't imply intentional directedness. I don't think it implies dispositional directedness, but nor do I think it implies any intentional directedness. That is, something which, when the efficient cause produces its effect, somehow is intending that or governing it in some way that is intelligent. The final thing that I want to say is that the conclusion 4 is actually compatible with various atheistic views. It's probably not compatible with naturalistic views, but it's compatible with various atheistic views. For example, an intelligent but morally indifferent creator, as well as infinitely many other non-theistic views. But anyway, let's continue.
We have a simplified version, which is this, that, next slide, intelligence underlies teleology. There's irreducible teleology immanent to the natural world and all throughout the natural world, so intelligence underlies the natural world. Okay.
Right, I mean, I also, again, this is going to suffer from a lot of the same problems.
Design in biology. Let's begin with the origin of organic life.
Now, at this point in Cameron's stream, Chad started making some really wild claims. I myself was going to go on a tangent with respect to those claims, but I found someone else who did a really nice tangent for me, so that I don't have to go on the tangent. So anyway, I'm going to be playing this video. It's called Significantly Less Than 100 Arguments for God. It's from this channel that I haven't even heard of them before seeing this, but, and I'm also not endorsing this video. I am endorsing the clip that I'm going to be playing for you, but I'm not endorsing the video itself.
Design in biology. Let's begin with the origin of organic life. I don't know about you, Cameron, but when I was in high school, they were still teaching the Miller experiment.
Yes, in the same way that they teach about Pasteur's experiment, which is even older. Almost like teaching about the first groundbreaking experiment that led to a whole new field of research is an important step in teaching how we got to the scientific ideas that we have today.
The Miller experiment, let's see if I remember it, is
It's always a good sign when someone is trying to refute something that they can't even remember.
an experiment. The main guy was named Miller, but he had some solution that they thought resembled like prebiotic soup of Earth's early atmosphere.
I don't
And
think I have no clue if I was taught it, but now I remember hearing about it.
And so what he did is just basically shoot like bolts of electricity into this prebiotic suit, and he was able to synthesize amino acids. And this was touted as being this groundbreaking experiment that is a clue to how life originated.
They simulated what they thought was the early Earth environment and discovered that under plausible prebiotic conditions, amino acids can form. This wasn't just touted as being a groundbreaking experiment, it was a groundbreaking experiment. It was a completely successful experiment, and when the sealed vials were examined decades later with more sensitive equipment, the scientists were able to identify 14 amino acids compared to Miller's original 5. And on top of that, there was a sister experiment, run also by Miller around the same time, whose results were never published, but its vials were also sealed, and a modern examination yielded 22 amino acids from that one, many with attached hydroxyl groups, which would make them more susceptible to reacting and developing into an even larger diversity of molecules as time goes on. So, yes, they got the early Earth atmosphere wrong, but they demonstrated that amino acids can form naturally, and our more recent re-examination has demonstrated a certain amount of stability in the resulting acids. And since we have also found amino acids that have formed naturally in some pretty harsh conditions as well, like on meteorites, it is now well-established science that amino acids can form naturally. And this well-established science had its beginnings in the Miller-Urey experiment, which you seem to be implying is somehow irrelevant.
Which has since just been completely abandoned.
You know what? At the beginning of this stream, they were making a big deal about how they're using peer-reviewed publications as their sources for all of these arguments, and you can find more information in the literature. And Cameron was mentioning how they've been preparing for this presentation for months now. You'd think that in such a well-prepared presentation where they pride themselves on their use of peer-reviewed literature, they would have at least spent some of the time in scientific literature when it's relevant, as well as the philosophical literature, because the 5 seconds that it would have taken to Google Miller-Urey modern research would have taken you straight to a paper that was published in my favorite journal, PNAS, in 2017, which shows that a Miller-Urey style experiment can produce RNA nucleobases. In the future, please do some very basic research before speaking definitively about how useless one of the most groundbreaking experiments of the 20th century was. I'm pretty sure he's trying to set up a life can't come from non-life, therefore God style argument right now, but let's just think for a moment. Can we really trust someone's scientific opinion on whether or not simple life could develop from the chemistry of the early Earth when they aren't even passingly familiar with the history of origin of life research?
Anyway, we have an argument in biology from organic life. Given what we know, complex organic life in the universe could not have originated naturalistically. If given what we know, complex organic life could not have originated naturalistically, it's reasonable to believe that it originated supernaturalistically. So it's reasonable to believe that complex organic life originated supernaturalistically.
So premise 1 here is ambiguous between 2 readings. First, it could be, we don't know how complex organic life could have originated naturalistically. That's one reading. The second reading is that we do know that complex organic life could not have originated naturalistically. Now, under that first understanding, premise 1 is true, but premise 2 is just obviously false. It doesn't follow from the fact that we don't currently know how complex organic life could have originated naturalistically. It doesn't follow from that that it's reasonable to believe that it originates supernaturalistically. We also don't know currently what the precise naturalistic causes are of autism or dark matter and so on, but that clearly doesn't license us to conclude that it's reasonable to think that these things are somehow supernaturally brought about. No, that's just absurd. So under the first reading, premise 2 is obviously false. But under the second reading of premise 1, then premise 1 is obviously false. No, we don't know that complex organic life couldn't have originated naturalistically. If we do know that, publish your results. You would become famous in the scientific community. Publish your results in the journal Nature or something. Go, do it. Collect your Nobel Prize. So anyway, I think under either plausible interpretation of this first premise, this argument is just so utterly implausible. Now, I will say also that this all just somewhat makes God look incompetent. It's like God made a system with various purposes in mind, for example, to harbor intelligent life, and yet he did such a bad job that he had to supernaturalistically intervene to make sure that intelligent life can develop. Like, it's as if I wanted to make an ice skating arena. I built it, and I was like, well, crap, the water in this arena won't freeze, since I built the arena in such a way that the arena is 35 degrees rather than below 32 degrees. So I had to go out and, like, buy ice sheets to intervene and implant in the system. That just seems to show, like, a lack of foresight. I don't know, it seems to indicate at least an incompetent God. That isn't necessarily an argument, it's just something that's always struck me as odd about this sort of thing. It's like, seriously, God's designing this, like, wonderful universe and so on, but, like, he needs to supernaturalistically intervene to, like, zap life into it? Like, come on. But in any case, let's continue.
And so we have some resources here. There's a classic book, Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson's The Mystery of Life's Origin, which is dated, and Meyer's signature in a cell, in some respects, is an attempt before there was life. There's divine intervention argument. Now for this, you need to sort of begin by imagining Earth before there was life. Now you can run the argument. So just imagine Earth, no life, and now let's think. Given that God intervenes to produce life on Earth, there's no chance at all that there will be no benefit, there will be no life on Earth. The probability of the conjunct God intervenes to produce life on Earth and life does not occur is 0. Okay, that seems true. 2, if God does not intervene to produce life on Earth, the probability that life will occur here is very low. It is just as reasonable to bet that God will intervene to produce life on Earth as that he won't. The subjective probability here is around 50-50. Let's just take that for argument. Pretty conservative assumption there.
Oh, that is that is so implausible.
But
it's a conservative estimate. The subjective probability. Maybe it's a conservative estimate for Chad's probability, but for anyone who isn't even a theist, and even those who are like, oh my gosh.
Will be life on Earth. We know that because there is life on Earth, so it's very likely that God will intervene to produce life on Earth. It's a probability argument for God's producing life on Earth.
Oh, this is painful. So this is a classic case of likelihood ratio rigging. So imagine that I argue as follows. Well, given that God intervenes to bring about Susan's winning the lottery, there is no chance at all that Susan fails to win the lottery. If God does not intervene to bring about Susan's winning the lottery, well then the probability that Susan wins the lottery is extremely low. Suppose she has like one ticket out of hundreds of billions of tickets in a fair lottery. And then I go on to say, oh, well, it's just as reasonable to bet that God intervenes to bring about Susan's winning the lottery as that he doesn't. But Susan does in fact win the lottery. We suppose that she's the winner. So it's very likely that God intervenes to bring about Susan's winning the lottery. No, this is just absurd. Yes, of course, we can rig a hypothesis so that the likelihood ratio significantly favors it. Yeah, of course, if your hypothesis is that God intervenes to produce life on Earth, well then, yeah, the likelihood ratio is definitely going to be favoring that hypothesis over pretty much any other hypothesis. But this is only done at the cost of making the prior probability of your hypothesis ludicrously unlikely. This is assuming that God exists, God has a character which leads him to desire to intervene, desire to produce a universe, and indeed to produce a universe including Earth, and indeed not only including Earth, but producing life on Earth. All of these claims, you're building in so much immodesty into your hypothesis. Why? Why does God have this particular desire to intervene and produce life on Earth? Oh, maybe because life is super duper valuable. But like, why on Earth? It could be any other planet. He could have non-physical beings. He could have whole concoctions of different forms of life in different universes and so on. So like, the prior probability among this like infinite array of possible ways that God could bring about the concoction of values, only a small sliver of those is actually God's intervening to produce life on Earth. So even if it's super duper valuable and God's desires track value, why would you think that God intervening to produce life on Earth is any more probable than any of these other infinitely many other scenarios that God could produce that similarly involve either life of some kind, but a very different form of life on a very different forms of planets in a very different universe, or perhaps sentient life, which isn't even physical. Maybe it's in the mind of God, or maybe it's electrons in love with different psychophysical laws. There's a whole panoply of different ways that God could produce relevantly similar values. Again, I'm not saying these questions are unanswerable, obviously, but again, those answers are just building in more theses into your hypothesis. You're making it more and more complex, and you're driving its prior probability lower and lower and lower. So I think really premise 3 is just absurd, honestly. There are infinitely many other ways God could secure the relevant goods, and so it's not as reasonable to bet that God will intervene to produce life on Earth as that he won't. Firstly, this is assuming that God exists as opposed to the boatloads of other non-theistic worldviews, of which naturalistic materialism isn't the only one. There are boatloads, including ones that include something like God, but that isn't theistic. So you might have an aesthetic deism hypothesis that Paul Draper develops. You have boatloads of other hypotheses. So even among those hypotheses with God in them, it's going to be a very small fraction of the probability space. And even within that probability space wherein God exists, in only a small sliver of that small fraction of the probability space, will there be worlds in which God intervenes to produce life on Earth? Because in lots of those other worlds, within this small portion of the probability space in which God exists, he either doesn't create anything at all, or he just creates a physical universe with no life, or the life that he does create is super duper different, and it's on different sorts of planets and so on. Or maybe he creates various fundamental particles and has different psychophysical laws where they all enter in different relationships with one another and they sing praises to God. Or maybe he produces just non-physical minds that are in some sort of non-physical realm that engage in relationships with one another and so on. So anyway, no, the hypotheses with God in them are only a small fraction of the probability space, the total probability space of hypotheses. And moreover, the ones that have God in them, it's only a small slice of those that include God intervening to produce life on Earth.
So design in biology, we have organic structures. As an analogical arguments in general are pretty weak. Some things in nature resemble human artifacts. 2, human artifacts are the product of intentional design. 3, so we should infer that things in nature that resemble human artifacts are also products of intentional design. If there are things in nature that are the products of intentional design, God exists, so God exists. And as an analogical arguments in general are pretty weak. So it's not difficult to poke a lot of holes in this as Hume, or at least as you can gather that Hume does. But what more careful scholars on Paley's design argument have pointed out is that a more faithful version of Paley's argument isn't really analogical, it's deductive.
Okay, so that's the deductive version. Let's look at the number 35 before we go on to number 36, because this is apparently an argument in its own right, number 35, even though it's vulgar, and he seems to be saying that, no, it's not very strong, so... but anyway, let's still examine it. I think evolution probably does serve as a defeater for the inference from 1 and 2 to 3. Evolution provides us an explanatorily rich, exceptionally empirically confirmed account of the appearance of design. Notice the appearance of design, without actually invoking a designer itself to account for the appearance of design. In other words, we have a perfectly naturalistically acceptable, explanatorily rich, exceptionally empirically confirmed account of various things in nature that resemble human artifacts, and yet the account there doesn't require adducing anything like an intentional designer. So I think evolution arguably does provide a defeater for the inference from 1 and 2 to 3. Moreover, I think parity arguments abound. I can say some things in nature resemble incompetent or evil human artifacts. There are certain parasites that sting their caterpillars to paralyze them, and then they lay their eggs inside of them, and then of course the eggs develop and grow and so on, all the while the caterpillar is just paralyzed. And then of course the eggs hatch, and then the wasp babies or whatever, the larvae or whatever they're called, they eat their way out not only of their eggs, but also of the caterpillar. So they eat the caterpillar alive, and they burst through its skin later on. So, yeah, lovely, isn't it? No. So, some things in nature resemble incompetent or evil human artifacts. This whole system of predation, where the norm is either like starving, or somehow being frustrated, or just trying to survive and not get eaten alive by some other predator. Lots of things in nature actually resemble incompetent or evil human artifacts. These are the sorts of things that humans do when they create weapons and so on to harm each other. So I've only covered the evil thing, but incompetent things as well. So consider the recurrent laryngeal nerve. It goes down and like, instead of the distance between the larynx and the brain, which is where it's supposed to go, just from the brain to the larynx, the distance is only something like, what, a few inches or something like that. But no, it actually goes down, down, down into the chest, around an artery, and then up, back up into where your larynx is. Now, in the case of us, that's not much of a detour. But in the case of giraffes, I think it's something like a 30-feet detour. So this is something in nature that resembles an incompetent human artifact. Some human artifacts are just ludicrously inefficient. And moreover, incompetent or evil human artifacts are the product of incompetent or evil intentional design. So given those two premises that I just gave in my parity argument, we can conclude via the same inference rule here, we should infer that things in nature that resemble incompetent or evil human artifacts are also the products of incompetent or evil intentional design. And then the next premise, if there are things in nature that are the products of incompetent or evil intentional design, then, since God is the designer of nature, God is at least partly incompetent or evil. And of course, if that's true, then theism is false. Hence, theism is false. So we seem to have an equally powerful argument against theism on our hands here. Moreover, even if we granted that various design-like features of organisms in nature, in the natural world, provide some confirmatory evidence for theism, there are various more specific facts about design-like features of the natural world that strongly favor naturalism over theism. So, for instance, there is teleological evil, where it seems as though the very design plan of some organisms includes causing some sort of languishing or some sort of profound suffering in other organisms. Predators come to mind, parasites come to mind, viruses come to mind, and so on. So various more specific facts about the teleological directness that we find in nature seem very surprising on theism compared to naturalism, even if the general fact of teleological directness in nature and complexity and so on favors theism over naturalism, which I've argued it doesn't seem to.
But what more careful scholars on Paley's design argument have pointed out is that a more faithful version of Paley's argument isn't really analogical, it's deductive. And it would go like this: if X is design-like, then X can only be the product of intentional design. Some things in nature are design-like, so those things are products of intentional design.
Yeah, so I'd probably just reject one. I think it's probably false. If X is designed like, then X can only be the product of intentional design. No, we can give you a perfectly coherent, naturalistic explanation, citing evolution by natural selection and so on, for the emergence of things that are design-like. That doesn't require intentional design. Moreover, consider snowflakes. They're design-like, but to say that they can only be the products of intentional design, like, no. Unless you think that God is, like, tinkering with the clouds and so on to make those. Of course, the very question at issue, though, is whether or not there is a designer, so...
A contemporary version, a defense of Paley, would be Michael Behe-style arguments from irreducibly complex organisms.
And such such arguments appealing to irreducible complexity and intelligent design have been subjected to immense critical scrutiny from evolutionary biologists and so on. And in fact, there was a court case on this, and they brought in professional biologists and so on, and the jury found that, no, actually, this is kind of pseudoscience. So I don't really take intelligent design all that seriously, but I tend to focus more on philosophy than this sort of thing in general, and at least defeasibly, we should defer to relevant expert consensus when we ourselves are not among the experts. And in this case, the expert consensus really is against irreducible complexity and so on. That's a pretty significant weight of a reason to be very skeptical of those sorts of considerations. But anyway, let's listen to Pruss's analogical argument.
Pruss's analogical design argument.
Okay, so Pruss has this argument. DNA is like an intentionally designed computer program. Intentionally designed computer programs have intelligent designers. So if DNA is like an intentionally designed computer program, it too probably has an intelligent designer. So DNA probably has an intelligent designer. And he's got a lot of interesting arguments in defense of this argument. Designer.
I haven't looked at this source, and so I'm guessing that he addresses the objections that I'm going to be raising, but I will still raise them nonetheless because I'm just giving a commentary based on my epistemic vantage point. So I think premise 3 is arguably defeated by evolution. Evolution gives us a perfectly coherent naturalistic account and an explanatorily powerful naturalistic account, or at least it can be supplemented with a kind of naturalistic account wherein you don't adduce an intelligent designer behind the process, wherein you can get the appearance of things being designed, including the appearance of things being designed like a computer program. The very fact that this is an explanatorily powerful and naturalistic-friendly option on the table, by my lights, gives us at least an undercutting defeater for premise 3. And of course, we have a parity argument similar to the one that I offered earlier. I can say DNA is like an evilly or incompetently intentionally designed computer program. Like birth defects, childhood cancer? Yeah, that is certainly like an incompetent or evilly intentionally designed computer program. Imagine a computer program which is such that when you run it on your computer, your child gets brain cancer. So DNA is like an incompetently or evilly intentionally designed computer program. And moreover, incompetently or evilly designed computer programs have incompetent or evil intelligent designers. And so, third premise, if DNA is like an incompetently or evilly intentionally designed computer program, then it too probably has an incompetent or evil intelligent designer. So we can conclude that DNA probably has an incompetent or evil intelligent designer. But if that's true, then theism is false, since according to theism, the designer of DNA is God, and God is not in any respect incompetent or evil. So it follows that theism is false. So yet again, we seem to have a parity argument, which is just as plausible as this one, if not more plausible, that delivers the falsity of theism.
Design in biology, and here we have information. Information here just means specified complexity, a complex arrangement or a pattern that has function or that has meaning, okay? And the argument would go, information is inherent to the building blocks of life. So it's not like Pruss said that there's something like information. No, this argument says, no, there is information inherent to the building blocks of life. Information is the product of intelligence. If information is inherent to the building blocks of life, then the building blocks of life themselves are the byproduct of intelligence. So the building blocks of life are the byproduct of intelligence. And
it just depends upon what we mean by information. If we just mean, and I know he gave a number of different meanings for it. He put out there like specified complexity, he mentioned functions, and he also mentioned meaning. None of these are equivalent, they're not interchangeable. So how we assess this argument depends on what we mean by information. If we just mean features of something that certain functions take as input to produce output, then premise 1 is plausible. There is, in some sense, input to certain functions that, let's say, ribosomes perform, and they provide an output together with tRNA and other sorts of things that go into transcription and translation, particularly as I was just talking about at translation. So premise 1 would then be plausible, but premise 3 is just false. For there to be ribosomes, and for ribosomes to perform this function, to take some input value, perform some operation, and then output something, that doesn't require there to be intelligence, not at all. At the very least, no atheist would ever grant that that requires intelligence. But, of course, if we mean something like meaningful or interpreted features of symbols, then yeah, premise 3 is probably true. Meaning and interpretation do seem to presuppose something like intelligence. But then premise 1 will be false, at least by the naturalist's lights. My point here is just that we don't have anything here that would or should convince someone who isn't already convinced of theism. So I don't think this argument gives anyone any reason to accept theism. Now, the next thing to note is, of course, evolution. I think we can explain why these various sorts of functions which take inputs, perform some operation on them, and give some output. I think you can have a perfectly coherent, naturalist-friendly, evolutionary explanation of the origin of these sorts of things. Now, of course, the first collection of RNA-like molecules or DNA-like molecules of course, couldn't have been produced by natural selection, but then, of course, you're starting to get into the origin of life arguments, and we've already covered those. Now, for lots of these arguments, I'm being intentionally brief because I just don't really take the intelligent design stuff all that seriously. Like, God can create a universe in which all sorts of beautiful and complex structures organically and naturally emerge, but oh man, that bacteria flagellum, yeah, that requires God to step in and inject some of his divine juices. And so God's over here just like tinkering with bacterial flagella, but oh no, those starving children, no help for them. It's like, okay.
And building blocks would be things like genes, expressions, proteins, DNA. So let's go to Tennant's argument from cosmic teleology. And F.R. Tennant, he was the Richard Swinburne of suitable for intelligent moral, dissipates almost all of Swinburne's arguments. So we have one, the universe is conspicuously suitable for intelligent moral beings in many ways. And he has these 6 different ways. There's just one universe with necessary ingredients for life. Those ingredients have come together, at least in one place on Earth, to make an environment not just habitable, but conducive to flourishing. Some of those...
Right, let's just pause there. 1A is questionable. Why I think there's only one universe? I mean, you could say it, but, publish your results, right? That revolutionized the scientific community. Yeah, so 1A is at least questionable. I don't think we have sufficient reason to accept it. With respect to 1B, yes, there's a sense in which the environment that we have, it's certainly hospitable and conducive to flourishing in some ways, but it's also extremely conducive, I would argue far more conducive, to languishing. Languishing predominates. 99% of all species have gone extinct, and even the species that are extant. The norm, when you look around, is nature red in tooth and claw. Things ripping each other to shreds, things causing suffering to other things starving, limitations of resources, overproduction of offspring such that most offspring die young, and so on. So I think it'd be better to say that the environment is more conducive to the languishing of most organic lives and the flourishing of very, very few organic lives. The lucky few who get to live a long and at least relatively flourishing life.
Those world's flourishing inhabitants find the world intelligible. Being intelligible, they also find it beautiful. And all of these facts together suggest the unfolding of a plan behind which there is purposive intelligence. So all these facts are all facts about the universe, which...
Well... One thing that we should say is if they are suggestive of a plan, which is doubtful in itself, the plan seems to be morally indifferent. At the best, it seems to be morally indifferent given the predominance of languishing, as I mentioned.
So, too, if the universe is conspicuously suitable for intelligent moral beings in many ways, then it should be regarded as a theater for the lives of intelligent moral agents designed by God. So, the universe should be regarded as a theater for the lives of intelligent moral agents designed by God.
Yeah, so I guess my question here is, why should we accept 2? Of course, I know I can read Tennant, but my point for this video is that I really haven't been doing additional research for it, additional to what I've already done for the past years or whatever. I'm still going to say, why should we accept premise 2? We can only conclude to God as a designer on our total evidence, and it's not at all clear that our total evidence, in concert with the priors of theism and atheism, supports theism. And indeed, a lot of the features of the universe, of this purported moral theater that was designed for us, a lot of the features of this seem to count against a theistic origin. They seem to be conspicuously badly arranged. For starters, consider the fact that 99.999999999% of this theater is like a death trap. Of course, that doesn't disprove God's existence. Of course, it's not incompatible with God's existence. But of course, if, for instance, you had a father designing a house for the purpose of giving it to his son, but then when the son goes in, this house is like as big as these giant mansions and so on, but the son goes in and he can only stay on the first floor out of the 100 floors, and if he even goes to any other floor, he dies immediately. Like, we would conclude that, that something went wrong with the dad or something. Either it's not a loving dad, or the dad's maybe pulling some prank or trick or something like that, because the vast majority of this theater that was supposed to be for the kid is devastatingly inhospitable. It's a death trap. Anywhere the kid goes, except for this really small portion of it, would suffocate the kid, let's say. Just as such a mansion is not what we would expect from a perfectly good and effective father with respect to designing a mansion for the son, it seems that this is not at all what we would expect from a perfectly good and perfectly efficient God if he's designing a theater for the lives of intelligent moral agents. So there are various features of the universe not mentioned here that seem to count against a theistic origin. You can pick out certain evidential chips and say, oh, well, those might favor theism over naturalism, but of course, you have to look at your total evidence. In any case, here's how I think this argument could be improved. You could just say that theism better predicts a universe conspicuously suitable for intelligent moral beings compared to naturalism, such that the data in question evidentially confirms theism over naturalism. And that isn't implausible. I guess a remaining worry is why think theism predicts this, or at least predicts it better than naturalism. As I pointed out elsewhere in this video, it seems God could secure the relevant goods in infinitely many other ways.
And the other remarkable thing about this argument is he was ahead of his time in that it presupposes compatibility with evolution. Almost no one prior to Tennant was making design arguments that presuppose compatibility with evolution. Fine-tuning arguments. So we have fundamental constants and laws of the universe.
Yeah, now these design...
So we have examples of the fundamental constants and laws of the universe: fine structure constant, electromagnetic interaction, alpha, gravitation, the weak nuclear force, proton-electron mass ratio, density and speed of the expansion of the universe. And we have examples of fine-tuning, which I'm sure most of your viewers will be very familiar with. So maybe it'd be better, rather than to go through these examples, they can just pause it later and look at them. And we have several different ways we could run a fine-tuning argument based on this data. One would be by elimination.
And, okay, note that these are all just various different versions of essentially the same argument, basically. So they're not going to be independent of one another, and so they're not going to satisfy what you would need to satisfy in order to run the stuff that they run at the end.
The fine-tuning of the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. It's not due to either chance or necessity, so it's due to design. And that, of course, is Craig's favored way of formulating the argument, which he got from...
Okay, so firstly, I'm going to say premise one is a false trichotomy. Perhaps it's due to some disposition on the part of a fundamental naturalistic reality. This is neither chance, nor physical necessity, nor design. Or perhaps it's due to metaphysical necessity. That's neither chance, nor physical necessity, nor design. And so on. So I think premise one is just false. But anyway, set that aside. I would argue that premise two is undermotivated. Of course, the reason why he rules out chance is because he, as in Craig, the reason why he rules out chance is because that would be enormously improbable, so he argues. But one thing to say here is it? I'm going to point out later some of Aaron Lucas's work, in particular his paper Naturals and Fine-Tuning in Flies. The various probability calculations within the fine-tuning data, it seems, are based on keeping the law structures constant and just simply varying the constants. That's what is the epistemically illuminated region. And yes, arguably, in the epistemically illuminated region, only a very small proportion of the universes within that epistemically illuminated region can support life. But it's a far too hasty generalization to go from that to saying that all universes whatsoever, even when you vary the structure of those laws, would likewise have a very small proportion of life-permitting universes to life-forbidding universes. That's just a far too hasty generalization. And yet that's the fraction that you would need to calculate, it seems, in order to run the improbability-style argument here. Moreover, when you're rejecting this chance hypothesis because it's enormously probable, that's only a reason for rejecting chance in favor of design if it's also not enormously improbable on the design hypothesis, and if the prior probability of the design hypothesis isn't far lower than that of the chance hypothesis. And it's not at all clear whether these conditions are met. With respect to that first condition, and as I've emphasized throughout this, there seem to be infinitely many ways that God could secure the relevant goods of our created order that don't involve fine-tuning a physical universe. Maybe God could have some sort of simulation. Maybe God could have some sort of dreams in his mind. Maybe God could just have particles that are like millions of light years away, but yet the psychophysical laws are different, so that when they're in a certain distance from each other, they have a certain relationship, and when they are other distance away from each other, they sing praises to God. When they emit certain waves, or when they change spin, maybe they grow in their relationship with God, or whatever. Insert any sort of sci-fi story you want. We could all be non-physical beings in some sort of non-physical realm, and so on. There are boatloads of ways to secure the relevant goods, and it's not at all clear why God would choose to secure these goods or these values in a way that involves fine-tuning the universe as opposed to doing all these other sorts of things, many of which aren't even possible under naturalism. As for ruling out physical necessity, well, the main reason that Craig gives for ruling this out is, it's not physical necessity because, there's no reason to think so. But of course, that's burden shifting. The onus of justification is on him to rule that out, to give us some reason to think it's false. You can't just say, there's no reason to think it's true.
Landing it from William Dembski's book, The Design Inference.
I was just going to say that this version actually has some benefits that not many people know about. And so there's one in particular I'm thinking about right now, which is in the other versions, like you see from Robin Collins, and even I think Luke Barnes might be susceptible to this, is that there's this question in the problem of evil literature about skeptical theism. So skeptical theism is this idea that we can't really be confident about what God would do in this world in terms of like what he would allow, what kind of horrendous evils he would allow and whatnot. So there's this question of like, how much do we really know about what God would intend or would do? And so this actually, if we think about that response to the problem of evil in terms of a response to these kind of design arguments, which seem to look at what God is intending to do with nature, then it would seem to actually cut both ways. So it would make us skeptical about these arguments from evil, but then it would also seem to make us skeptical about these arguments from design because we're not really sure what God's intentions are. But the reason why I'm even bringing this out and talking about this is because this version, I studied this a couple years back, and I discovered that this version by Craig is kind of clever because it doesn't actually involve that at all. It just says fine-tuning the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. Fine-tuning is not due to either chance or physical necessity, so fine-tuning is due to design. So what's sort of interesting about this version of the fine-tuning argument is that it avoids all those types of concerns, which is interesting. It's also Craig is very careful when he formulates his arguments, because this is completely compatible with his views on the problem of evil and what he thinks we can.
So, no, that's mistaken. Let's suppose we have the following scenario. So I give the first premise. The ticket that won the lottery is either ticket number 1, or it's ticket number 2, or it's ticket number 3, or it's ticket number 4, or, and so on throughout 100 million, let's say. But, this is my second premise, the ticket that won the lottery isn't number 2, and it also isn't number 3. Oh, and it's also not number 4, and it's also not number 5, and so I go through these individually. And why? Well, I say, oh, because each is individually enormously improbable. And so we have really good, strong reason to reject each of those individually. And then I can conclude from that ticket number 1 won. So ticket number 1, I can literally conclude that that's the one that's the winner. And I can do this even before the winner is chosen. Now, this is a patently absurd kind of reasoning. Just because you can do this disjunction and then go try to attack each disjunct apart from one of the disjuncts and try to reject them, you have to ask, do your objections against that also target the one disjunct that you're not leveling the objection toward? And you also have to see if there are additional problems afflicting the disjunct that you didn't target that don't inflict all those other disjuncts. So basically, it's a problem for the justification for the second premise. At least the justification for the second premise in relation to trying to rule out the other hypotheses in relation to the one that you're trying to favor. And so similarly, if Craig would go through and say, oh, well, it's not due to chance because that's enormously improbable. But of course, you could say the exact same thing with respect to his design hypothesis. You can talk about why that's super duper improbable. You can talk about the considerations that I just leveled with respect to there being infinitely many ways that God could secure the relevant goods that don't involve fine-tuning the physical universe and so on. Or you could raise considerations of saying, well, we don't even know what God would do given skeptical theism, and so that probability is inscrutable. And so it's actually in no better position than the chance hypothesis, because it's literally inscrutable what the probability would even be. And so the exact same style of objections that Craig is leveling to the chance hypothesis would equally be able to be leveraged toward the design hypothesis, such that you could equally justifiably say the fine-tuning of the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. It's not due to design, it's not due to physical necessity, therefore it's due to chance. So no, this isn't a benefit of Craig's argument. In fact, and I'm not accusing Craig of intentionally doing that, but if anything, it's subtly masking the deeper complexities. If anything, it's making it seem as though you can get a swifter inference to design than is actually required. And so in that sense, it's actually kind of deceptive. I'm saying that the argument is deceptive, not William Lane Craig, or not even his use of the argument. If this argument just popped into being uncaused, as Craig thinks is absurd, if this argument just popped into existence uncaused, it would still be a deceptive argument, just because it's deceptively simple. So I'm not attributing bad intentions to anyone. My point is just that this argument is deceptive in that it hides these considerations that I've been bringing to the fore here. And so I think Cameron is wrong. Skeptical theism does attack this, because it shows that the way that Craig goes to try to rule out these hypotheses here for his second premise would equally apply to his design thing, such that we could equally well say fine-tuning is not due to design or physical necessity or whatever, or it's not due to design or chance, therefore it's due to physical necessity or whatever. Again, it's similar to the ticket argument that I was just giving. The argument is kind of deceptive. I say, hey, it's either 1 or number 2 or number 3 or number 4 or whatever throughout 100 million. But then I go through the various hypotheses and say, oh no, it's definitely not number 2. What? That's super duper improbable. That only has a 1 in 100 million chance. You're 99.99999 whatever. Super duper confident that that isn't true. And so you're saying we could be really, really confident so we can rule that one out. And then you go through, you do the same thing with number 3, number 4, number 5, and then it follows logically and inescapably that ticket number 1 wins. No, that sort of reasoning is ludicrous. Why is that? Well, because the exact same justifications that you gave as to why you're ruling out number 2 and why you're ruling out number 3 and why you're ruling out number 4 would equally apply to your ticket number 1. And the same thing, as I've pointed out, goes for this justification that Craig offers on behalf of his second premise. There's no avoiding considerations of prior probability and considerations of the likelihood ratios. There's no avoiding the fact that skeptical theism might still bear on this sort of argument.
If we compare that to the other formulations, which all have as a central point that given that the universe permits the existence of intelligent, conscious agents, despite how easily it might not have, that significantly raises the probability of theism being true. And so the first one is just a quick Bayes argument, the probability that we have the evidence of fine-tuning, given our background knowledge, K, and theism is false, is very low. The probability that we have this evidence, if theism is true, is very high. So that means that the probability that theism is true is much more likely than its probability that's not being true given the evidence. So the probability of theism being true given the evidence is high.
One thing that I want to note is that it's not entirely clear that premise 1 is true, though it's at least somewhat plausible. Now, I want to give some reasons for thinking that this is not exactly clear. So the first one, and obviously we're not going to go through this whole video, in fact, I just want to make you guys aware of it. It is a discussion on real atheology between Aaron Lucas and the members of the real atheology team with respect to his paper on naturalism, fine-tuning, and flies. And he talks about the difficulties in establishing this first premise. You can also find his paper, Naturalism, Fine-Tuning, and Flies, by searching up that title. The next thing that I want to look at is, oh my goodness, this is so long ago. Wow, 2020. So on Crusade Against Ignorance, I did a video, and I talked a little bit about the fine-tuning argument. I talk about this particular objection, and I just basically articulate it for a popular audience. And again, this is going to be on 1.5 times speed.
So the first objection is, why so listed? Okay, so the justification for the probability of the evidence given naturalism as being low is restricted to the following ratio. So it's the possible life-permitting universes with our law structures divided by the total possible universes with our law structures. And the reason this is true is because what we do is when we do this fine-tuning evidence is we keep the law structures constant. Like, for instance, we keep the gravitational equation is something like the gravitational force equals big G times mass 1 times mass 2 divided by like the inverse square of distance or whatever, something like that. And so what we do is we keep the form or the structure of that equation the same, and we just alter different constants or values. We alter that G, for instance, the gravitational constant, or various other things like the cosmological constant, but we keep the law structures the same. So what we're doing is we're looking at possible, well, at least epistemically possible. It's a further question as to whether it's metaphysically possible, but that's not relevant to a Bayesian argument because we're talking about our epistemic credence. So possible life-permitting universes with our law structures divided by total possible universes with our law structures, yeah, that's quite a small ratio. I'm not going to contest the physics. I'm not a physicist, cool. But the low value of this ratio neither means nor entails a low value for the following ratio. And a low value for the following ratio is what is required for the fine-tuning argument. And this ratio is possible life-permitting universes divided by total possible universes. Notice that we don't have the sort of with our law structures proviso. Mm-hmm. So if life-permitting universes took up a large portion of the space of total possible universes, then our universes supporting life wouldn't be all that surprising, right? Because then this would be a kind of a high, at least not a low, not an exceedingly low ratio. And that's regardless of the value of the first ratio. And so this in turn provides an undercutting defeater, since we have no reason to believe that the reference class of possible universes sharing our law structures is representative of the class of all possible universes, right? So if we wanted to infer from this ratio as being low to this ratio as being low, we would have to say that this reference class, the reference class with our laws, our law structures, the denominator here is representative of the class of total possible universes, this reference class. The denominators would have to be, one would have to be representative of the other, but we have no reason for thinking that's true. Now, flies, walls, and guns, oh my, this is where Leslie's fly analogy comes up. I'm borrowing ideas from Aaron Lucas that he developed in his paper, Naturalism, Fine-Tuning, and Flies. So imagine that we're in a dark room and there's an illuminated portion on the wall, perhaps by a flashlight or something. And on the wall, there's a little fly. Okay, there's like one fly, and it takes up a small portion on this. Let's say it's meters or maybe 1 meter in radius, a circle on the wall that's illuminated. And you hear a gunshot, and you look at the wall, and the fly is dead. Like the bullet hit the fly. Okay, and so clearly we would think that there must have been intent behind that shot, right? There must have been design there. That's true regardless of whether or not this illuminated region, the amount or number of flies in this illuminated region compared to the area the flies take up within this illuminated region compared to the area of the illuminated region itself, even if we have no reason to think that ratio of the areas is representative of the whole entire wall. Like even if the whole entire wall is covered in flies, we'd still infer design. And so even though we have no reason to think that the illuminated portion is representative of the wall, we still infer design. And so hence we can still infer design in the case of fine-tuning. But as philosopher Aaron Lucas points out, the inference to design or intention in the case of the fly analogy is underpinned by requisite background experience with flies and walls. For instance, we know that flies don't travel in packs like that. We generally know that flies on the wall, there aren't usually thousands upon thousands of them. We know about the behavior of people. We know that they don't like flies. So our inference to design and intention here is underpinned by a lot of background experience with flies and walls. That's why we can infer design, even though we don't have a reason to think it's representative. But no such background knowledge allows us to infer that the epistemically illuminated universes, that is to say the universes with our law structures, are representative of all possible universes. And so, in addition to this criticism, there are also disanalogies between them. So when God's choosing among the possible universes with different possible law structures, it would be absurd to just say that there's like some sort of illumination on our law structures as opposed to different law structures entirely that themselves could, for instance, there's no like illuminated flashlight region that would attract the eye of a designer in the case of Leslie's fly analogy. That's the restrictive objection. And then of course Miley Cyrus weighing in on the philosophy debate, which is obviously a tribute to John Leslie.
100%, yeah.
So anything, I guess this is the last one. So Robin Collins, this is kind of a big concession on his part. He says, quote, because we are considering only one reference class of possible law structures, it is unclear how much weight to attach to the values of epistemic probabilities one obtains using this reference class. Hence, one cannot simply map the epistemic probabilities obtained in this way onto the degrees of belief we should have at the end of the day. And he said that in his the teleological argument. And he's referencing the sort of the representativeness of our reference class to the total number, or to the total possible universe is that reference class, because we don't really have any reason that's representative. So Hudson, he's a brilliant philosopher, really awesome dude. So he argues that skeptical theism provides an undercutting defeater for fine-tuning. So skeptical theism rebuts, not, well, I guess I shouldn't say rebuts, it defeats the fine-tuning argument, specifically premise 2. So let's go back to the premise 2.
Go back to Miley Cyrus.
Yeah, the premise 2 is that the evidence given theism is not low. So the fine-tuning evidence given theism is not low. And what this requires is we kind of have to know about the preference structure of God. Skeptical theism is roughly the proposition that, for all we know, there are many facts, and we can call these iceberg facts, and I'll explain that in a second. There are many facts about the range of goods, evils, their values or weights, the necessary connections among them, and God's reasons for acting, of which we are unaware. Are the samples of such goods, evils, their values, and so on. The sample that we are aware of, skeptical theists argue that we just have no reason to think that that sample is representative of the total range of possible goods, evils, their values, their weights, the connections among them, and God's reasons for acting. So we can sort of think of this as like an iceberg. For all we know, we're just in the dark about whether the goods and evils and the connections among them that we have access to, that we have epistemic access to, we just have no reason if we're completely in the epistemic dark, as it were, about whether they make up just the tip of an iceberg of like a huge range of goods, evils, their values, the connections among them. And this, for instance, provides, some would argue, an undercutting defeater for various problems of evil, right? Because people will say like, oh, well, this is an instance of gratuitous evil. And people will be like, oh, well, how do you know? I mean, for all we know, we only have access to a small portion of goods, evils, or values and connections among them. So for all we know, God could have great reasons and great goods that come about from this. So it's sort of like the bottom of the iceberg of which we're unaware. We're not in the epistemic position to arbitrate. But if that's true, right, if skeptical theism, as I've outlined it, is true, well, then we're simply not in a position to know about the large-scale axiological structure of reality, and hence we are not in a position to know the probability that God would actualize a world with our law structures, right? If the axiological structure of our reality, like the distribution and profusion and intensity of goods and evils and their values, the connections among them, and so on and so forth, if that is very negative, right, if our world, the actual world, has an axiological structure overall that's quite negative, well, then actually God wouldn't actualize it. He'd actualize something else, or he'd refrain from doing it. But given skeptical theism, we're simply not in a position to know about the large-scale axiological structure of reality. For all we know, there are so many bad things, and of course good things as well, but so many bad things of which we're completely unaware that make it such that God would definitely not actualize a world with our law structures. And so it sort of provides an undercutting defeater for that premise about the probability of the evidence given theism. So skeptical theism provides us with a defeater, but also the existence of moral, conscious, rational creatures. I mean, for all we know, say the skeptical theist, for all we know, even though this is a great good, perhaps it's going to bring about a huge range and profusion of horrendous evils in the future. Perhaps there are necessary connections of which we are unaware that would, bring such evils about. And so even under the supposition that moral beings like us are incredibly valuable and that God would want to bring about and would have the desire and the power to bring it about, to bring creatures like us with our law structures about, for all we know, such law structures or the existence of creatures like us have necessary connections to profound evils of which we're unaware. And so skeptical theism is really going to undercut this probability. We're not really in an epistemic position to make judgments about God's desires and his full range of reasons for evolution. So here's another objection to the fine-tuning argument. So the probability of L given PB seems quite low, especially in relation to the probability of L star given PB. So what do I mean by here? So PB is there exists a perfect being which creates the world. That's what PB means. L is basically the hypothesis that the actual world's class of laws, L, is such that, given L, a necessary condition for the development of embodied, conscious, rational moral agents like us is hundreds of millions of years of profound agony, predation, parasitism, disaster, extinction, languishing, carnivory, and suffering. L star, by contrast, is that the actual world's class of laws, L star, in contrast to class of laws L, is such that, given L star, moral agents can or will develop without the precondition of hundreds of millions of years of suffering. Intuitively, the probability of L, given that the perfect being is that which designed the universe, that seems quite low. Seriously, I mean, if out of all the seemingly possible, especially epistemically possible, because that's the game that we're playing with the fine-tuning argument, given all the epistemically possible law structures, why on earth would a perfect being choose one that involves, in the very creative act, such horrendous suffering? If you read up, I mean, on a bunch of these fires in Australia, it's so sad.
It's terrible.
I get frustrated when I read it. I mean, upwards, I kid you not, the amount of animals that are burned alive from that is
The number of animals. The number.
actually in the hundreds of millions, I believe. I saw an article that was shared, and it's like thousands of koalas. I think it's actually now in the tens of thousands of koalas that are burned alive. And this is just today. Think about the hundreds
Millions of years, yeah.
of years of things like this. And that's only in Australia. I mean,
5 mass biological extinction events throughout the course of evolutionary history. I mean, the 6 that we're actively causing,
I don't know. It seems that the actual world's class of laws is one that we definitely would not expect a perfect being to create. And so the probability that even the law structures that we have is quite low on the supposition that the perfect being created it, as opposed to a different set of law structures that give rise to a much more benign, much more flourishing process of development, one not involving the languishing of non-moral sentient agents for hundreds of millions of years.
Now, of course, again, this will take us into really difficult, muddy waters, I will say right now, because the proponent of the fine-tuning argument will probably say, okay, fine, even if it's like super duper low probability, right, that you would get L conditional on PB, it's even much, much, much lower on naturalism, L conditional on naturalism. So that's something that they'll probably say at this juncture. But now we're getting into really tricky value judgments. I don't know. It strikes me as extremely implausible that this would be the set of law structures that a perfect being would choose, given that it involves all this sort of stuff rife within the very creative process of this being, rife within its very bringing about of the goods that are purportedly its intention. And is that as low as the probability of L conditional on naturalism? Well, part of what makes that difficult is the distinction between the epistemically illuminated region and non-epistemically illuminated region ones. But also, I don't know, it's just not clear. And I guess in criticizing the fine-tuning argument, all I need to do is show that it's at least not clear which one is going to be lower. So that would be enough to provide an undercutting defeater for the fine-tuning argument. I just wanted to say that I do think that that's probably a response that proponents of the fine-tuning argument would make to what I said in the video at this particular juncture. And I think there's going to be reasonable disagreement on which of those probabilities is going to be lower. Anyway, I did mention skeptical theism there, so if you want to know the place where I'm getting that, the Hudson thing, definitely check out this particular video right here.
That is to say...
Why is it playing? No, stop playing. Stop! Okay, A Critical Evaluation of the Fine-Tuning Argument for the Existence of God by Hudson. It's very good. That is not Hudson. Thank you, Leanne, for the introduction. Here's a picture of Hudson, and it's a wonderful talk. He's such a great public speaker. Oh, my goodness. So, yeah, you won't regret listening to this. All right, but back to the argument. So I've been looking here at both premises 1 and 2, but let's look at 2 in a little bit more detail. So at least for starters, I think it's really implausible that the probability here is very high. To improve this argument, you should just change it to not very low, or you could say nowhere near as low as this very low value. That would be a way to improve this kind of argument. It's difficult to justify how it's super duper high without just building into your hypothesis that God desires to bring about, let's say, a fine-tuned universe. But then, of course, the prior probability of your hypothesis suffers. So even though you're increasing the likelihood ratio between your hypothesis and your rival hypothesis, you're only doing that by correspondingly lowering your prior. But even after we make that change to saying that this is not as exceedingly low as this, there are still various problems that I want to raise for this argument. So one of them comes from this paper. It's entitled Divine Fine-Tuning versus Electrons in Love by Neil Sinababu. I think that's how you pronounce it. In this article, he's offering a new objection to the fine-tuning argument for God's existence, which arises from the metaphysical possibility of alternative psychophysical laws that permit a wider range of physical entities to have minds. I would actually argue that all you need here is the epistemic possibility. So I would actually argue that you don't even need the stronger claim of metaphysical possibility. Section 1 presents the fine-tuning argument according to which divine creation best explains why the physical constants permit intelligent life. Section 2 presents the objection that under sufficiently mind-friendly psychophysical laws, any physical constants permit intelligent life. Section 3 explains that proponents of the argument can't deny the metaphysical possibility of such psychophysical laws because they must accept a non-physical God with a mind. And then Section 4 considers a version of the argument restricted to universes with actual psychophysical laws and responds that there's no reason God would favor such universes. So, of course, he begins by laying out the probabilistic version of the fine-tuning argument. It has 2 premises as he articulates it. First premise is fine-tuning. For intelligent life to exist, as is the case, the fundamental physical constants must have values within very narrow life-permitting ranges. Premise 2, divine probability raising. If fine-tuning is true, it's more probable that God set the values of the constants than that they took those values without God's intervention. Conclusion, so God probably exists. Fine-tuning includes both the easily verifiable claim that intelligent life actually exists, and the scientifically supported claim that this requires the fundamental physical constants to take values within a very narrow range. Divine probability raising concerns the low probability of intelligent life without divine intervention and the higher probability of intentional life with a God. God's existence makes the existence of intelligent life more probable because minds are necessary for moral value, and a good God would care about creating a morally valuable universe. And that's the basic idea behind the argument. And then he gets into the objection from mind-friendly psychophysical laws. So what Neil argues in here is basically that he's attacking the first premise of the argument, that fine-tuning premise. What he says is that intelligent life is possible under a wide range of physical constants, because it's metaphysically possible, and I would say, because we're concerned only with epistemic possibility, with these Bayesian arguments, you could actually say, because it's epistemically possible, that psychophysical laws could be much more mind-friendly than those that obtain in actuality. Even if the physical constants permitted no atoms other than hydrogen, the psychophysical laws could permit protons and electrons to instantiate morally valuable mental states, including those involved in feeling pleasure, having friends, and falling in love. We're not saying that these things actually do experience pleasure, having friends, and falling in love, and nor are we saying that in a universe like ours they do. We're saying if you altered the psychophysical laws, the laws that connect physical states to mental states, And if you add an omnipotent God into the picture, God would be able to create all sorts of different universes with all sorts of different psychophysical laws that radically diverge from the actual world's psychophysical laws and the kind of actual universe that we find ourselves in. As Neil points out, the plausibility of fine-tuning depends on the metaphysical impossibility of psychophysical laws much more friendly to minds than those of our world. Only on the assumption that psychophysical laws must have their actual values is it true that intelligent life couldn't exist in a universe where the strong nuclear force is at less than 25% of its actual value, and atoms more complex than hydrogen can't be formed. Actual psychophysical laws require complex biological structures, like brains, for mental states to be realized. Universes with no atoms larger than the 1 proton, 1 electron combination of hydrogen lack the raw material that these biological structures require. But under more mind-friendly psychophysical laws, protons and electrons themselves could have minds like ours. These laws could dictate that these particles have sensory experiences of all of the forces other particles exert on them, with the forces most strongly affecting them giving rise to the psychology of belief and then intentional action. Protons and electrons could yearn to be together, feeling delight at the presence of the other as their opposite charges draw them closer. When they formed a hydrogen atom, they could fall in love. Whenever two electrons were a prime number of centimeters apart, they could have the mental states involved in heartfelt communication about their histories, and so on and so on and so on, right? You can fill out whatever story you really want here. So consider Collins's argument, right? Collins characterizes the kind of intelligent beings whose existence divine fine-tuning is supposed to explain as finite, vulnerable, embodied moral agents, and as embodied conscious beings that can make morally significant choices. But such beings can easily be realized in universes with the strong nuclear force at less than 25% of its actual value, and mind-friendly psychophysical laws. Microphysical particles are spatially finite, and sufficiently mind-friendly psychophysical laws will give them whatever sort of finite minds one pleases. As for vulnerability, microphysical particles are physically vulnerable to destruction in nuclear reactions or in interactions with antimatter. Psychophysical laws that allow them to love will also make them emotionally vulnerable. A proton that is attracted to an electron may be heartbroken if that electron goes away with another proton. And he basically just goes through that, like, yeah, you can secure moral agency in principle. Again, these only need to be epistemic possibilities. In short, there's plenty of room for psychophysical laws to be more mind-friendly than ours. Universes whose physical constants prevent any particularly complex structures from forming still have enough structure to instantiate minds if the psychophysical laws are mind-friendly enough. The large region of modal space, with mind-friendly psychophysical laws permitting happy microphysical particles, reveals intelligent life not to be an astonishingly improbable thing demanding a divine explanation, as it might be if fine-tuning were true. So again, this is targeting that first premise, this fine-tuning premise, that for intelligent life to exist, for there to be intelligent, conscious agents that instantiate these sorts of values that God would be interested in producing, the fundamental physical constants have to have like super narrow values, because only in that way can you get these like complex structures like brains and so on. But of course, that assumes that you're holding fixed these super duper narrow psychophysical laws. But of course, it's epistemically possible that you can alter these psychophysical laws in whole concoctions of ways. And so actually modal space is going to be populated with bunches of different worlds, which of course wouldn't support structures like our brains and things like that, but that would nevertheless support conscious, sentient, moral agents, and hence support the values that God would be interested in producing. And as I explained earlier on in the video, this actually might create certain problems for this premise here, that the probability of the evidence of fine-tuning given theism and the fact that the universe permits the existence of embodied conscious agents is very high. It could potentially challenge that because, again, as I've been explaining, there are arguably boatloads of different ways that God could secure the relevant goods that he was allegedly trying to secure by means of this finely tuned universe that we find ourselves in. There are boatloads of ways that he could do that in boatloads of other universes. Right? Even ones that aren't fine-tuned for our specific complex life. If the psychophysical laws could be different, which it seems epistemically possible that they could, God could still create life in those sorts of universes and intelligent, embodied, conscious agents in those worlds. And so it's actually not at all clear why God would prefer this sort of universe as opposed to that one. In which case, the probability that you get this kind of very narrow life-permitting range with respect to complex structures, it's actually not clear why that isn't super-duper low on theism as well. Because again, God has all these boatloads of different universes to choose from with different psychophysical laws that also realize the relevant values. Another article that I want to go through is this one by Neil Manson, How Not to Be Generous to Fine-Tuning Skeptics. So the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God requires that the probability that the universe is life-permitting, if God exists, is not nearly as low as the probability that the universe is life-permitting if God does not exist. Recently, some proponents of the fine-tuning argument have reasoned as follows. Stipulate that the probability that there exists a life-permitting universe if God exists is 1 in a billion. Only the most hardened skeptic would refuse odds like that, right? So, 1 in a billion is more than just fair to those skeptical of the fine-tuning argument. It is generous. Even on that generous assumption, the fine-tuning argument is very strong. This article explains why the assumption is not, in fact, generous. So, yada yada yada, he's talking about plug, which is the probability of a life-permitting universe under God's existence. So, probability life-permitting universe given God's existence. So that's what plug is. So then he goes on to consider what fine-tuning skeptics think. So in order to answer the question of whether or not people are right that it's generous to the fine-tuning skeptics to say, okay, let it be 1 in a billion, even still the fine-tuning argument would succeed. In order to evaluate that, we need to understand better the thinking of those skeptical of the claim that plug is not extremely low. Let's call such people fine-tuning skeptics. All fine-tuning skeptics who have written about the issue agree that there is no reason to think that plug is quite high. Several of them suggest a much stronger point. The value of plug is inscrutable. They claim to see no basis for assigning any probability at all to the proposition that God would create a life-permitting physical universe. Graham Oppie, Jan Narveson, Elliot Sober, and Stephen Jay Gould all express well the fine-tuning skeptic's position. Let's start with Oppie. Oppie says that given only the hypothesis that there is an intelligent designer of a universe, and given no further assumptions about the preferences of that designer, it is not clear to me that there is very much that one can conclude about the kind of universe that the designer is likely to produce. Oppie continues in private communication with Neil, what do we know about the range of natural realities that are open to God to create? It may be true that natural realities sufficiently similar to ours are all fine-tuned, but even so, fine-tuned natural realities could be just the tiniest blip in the full range of natural realities that are open for God to create. That is, that are creatable, consistent with all of God's attributes. I can't see any good grounds for assigning a probability, high or low, to the claim that God will create a fine-tuned natural reality. As Manson points out, one common theme amongst fine-tuning skeptics is that God is a being so unlike us that we simply cannot say what we ought to expect God to do with regard to creation. We should also note that fine-tuning skepticism is not limited to atheists or agnostics. Fideists, adherents of Reformed epistemology, and skeptical theists might all agree that reason alone gives us no answers to the sort of questions about God raised by Oppie and so on. Regarding skeptical theism in particular, Hud Hudson in various publications argues that the theist cannot make a plea for epistemic humility in the face of the problem of evil, and then turn around and insist that it is obvious that our universe is one of the sort that God would probably create. Skeptical theists, he says, are in no position to assert the high probability premise, Hudson's name for the claim that plug is quite high. Hudson writes that it is an inconstant and uneasy skeptical theism which professes ignorance about how much we know about just which things are possible goods, about just how good they in fact are, and about the necessary conditions of their realization in a wide variety of scenarios, but gratuitously grants an exception when it comes to pronouncing on what God is likely to aim at in creating a cosmos. Once again, we are in the dark about whether the possible goods in question are representative of the possible goods that there are, and about what far greater goods may of necessity be forfeited, or far greater evils may of necessity be guaranteed if the particular goods of embodied, free, intelligent, sentient beings are realized." End quote. And Hudson concludes from this that we don't have good reason to accept the high probability premise in the fine-tuning argument. In fact, we are not even in a position to assign any probability here at all. So this section in particular is the important one that I want to focus on, why fine-tuning skeptics say that plug is inscrutable. So one reason is we begin by making a simplifying assumption, and although it's not the only way to think of probabilities, a quite natural way to think of a probability is just as a proportion, n divided by m. The probability of getting an outcome with feature f is just the number n of outcomes with feature f divided by the number m of all possible outcomes, assuming all possible outcomes are equally likely to occur. So for some n and for some m, plug equals n divided by m. In the case at hand, let the numerator n sub t, t for theism, stand for the number of ways God might create a life-permitting universe, and let the denominator m sub t stand for the total number of ways God might make some possible world actual. Those ways include God's not creating anything at all, as well as all the ways God might create some reality distinct from himself. And then, of course, you can do this with atheism as well. So you let NA, A for atheism, stand for the total number of ways that there might have been a life-permitting physical universe conditional on atheism, and M sub A stand for the total number of ways that reality might have been conditional on atheism. So numbered amongst M sub A, so the total range of possible worlds under atheism, are not only all the possible distributions of matter and energy given the actual law structures and the actual values of the free parameters of physics, but also all the possible distributions of matter and energy given the actual law structures and every possible combination of values of the free parameters of physics. MA might be inflated further if the atheist includes possible physical universes with different law structures, with non-physical epiphenomenal properties, with possible physical universes with brutally emergent phenomena, and so on. And it might even be inflated further still if there could be realities consisting of combinations or fusions of any of the above. But precisely because of this, fine-tuning skeptics see M sub t as beyond comprehension. Why? Well, because they agree with theists that God is supposed to be omnipotent. So God can create any reality that could possibly exist if there were no God. If we suppose, as I think we should, says Oppie, that God could make any universe that is possible on the naturalist hypothesis, then we are surely entitled to the conclusion that the range of possibilities is no narrower on the theistic hypothesis than it is on the naturalistic hypothesis. Thus, for fine-tuning skeptics, M sub t is going to be at least as big as M sub a, and arguably much bigger. To see why M sub t might be much bigger than M sub a, consider first the physical universes that are impossible under atheism. These are physical universes in which God miraculously rearranges the matter and energy of the universe in any number of ways. Of course, some of these new possibilities will inflate N sub t, so the ones that are life-permitting. The possible realities that are life-permitting. For example, there will be ways for a life-unfriendly physical universe to yield embodied life through God's miraculously rearranging the matter and energy in that universe, by creating Boltzmann brains, for example. But some of these new possibilities will also inflate M sub t. For every way God could intervene to make a life-unfriendly physical universe have life in it, it seems that there are just as many ways that God could intervene in a life-friendly physical universe to guarantee that life never arises in it. In addition to these new possibilities for physical realities, God has the power to create realities with non-physical entities and processes that are not possible on atheism. Thus, God could create worlds in which occasionalism or Berkeleyan idealism turns out to be true. For the members of this enlarged set of possible worlds, if there are intelligent beings in them at all, those intelligent beings are either not actually or not necessarily embodied in living matter. The bearers of intelligence would not be living things, but rather souls, spirits, or immaterial minds. And then there are possible realities that fuse these possibilities, say by having a physical realm but also heaven, with angels spending most of their time in heaven but also able to interact in the physical realm. So these new possibilities introduced by theism inflate M sub t even further. Note that these are just the metaphysical possibilities we limited humans have imagined. Fine-tuning skeptics will think that theism generates other metaphysical possibilities of which no philosopher has yet dreamt. Proponents of the fine-tuning argument are surely chafing at this point. All of this is true if we assume that all of these possibilities are equally likely conditional on theism, they will say. But why should we do that? And if we should not, then simply coming up with a ratio n sub t divided by m sub t would not tell us the value of plug. It certainly is epistemically possible that not all of the metaphysical possibilities are regarded equally by God. There might be a preference function for God that assigns different probabilities to different possible worlds, or sets of worlds, depending on the overall features of those worlds. Given that God is supposed to be morally perfect, perhaps God would prefer worlds capable of producing intelligent life over worlds capable of producing only diprotons. That would be because, other things being equal, worlds containing intelligent life are better, that is richer or more valuable, than worlds containing only diprotons. But in response to this, even if fine-tuning skeptics are moral realists of some sort and so they agree that God has a preference structure that'll track these objective values, there are still serious questions about exactly what feature or features bear the weight of objective value in the fine-tuning argument. Is it materiality or physicality that makes some possible creations better than others? It's hard to see how mere physicality could set one possible creation apart from the rest. A universe that recollapsed a microsecond after the Big Bang would be physical, but that alone doesn't make it worth creating. Is it physical life that is intrinsically valuable? Well, bacteria are physical life forms, but being a reality such that bacteria might arise in it does not seem to be a particularly good-making feature of a possible creation. Is it intelligent or conscious physical life that is particularly worthy of creation? In that case, though, it seems that it is the intelligence or consciousness, not physicality or animation, that is doing the heavy lifting with respect to the value of this creation. Why think intelligence is only morally valuable if it is embodied? The problem here for proponents of the fine-tuning argument is that if God does exist, then clearly it is possible for there to be a non-physical intelligence. After all, God is supposed to be just such an intelligence. Why think God would prefer to create other intelligent conscious beings by creating a life-permitting physical universe? God had other, seemingly much more efficient and sensible options. For example, God could make Berkeley right. So even if they grant that God has a preference function over possible creations, fine-tuning skeptics are going to need to hear a lot more before they agree that the function favors the creation of a life-permitting physical universe, and favors it enough to make the fine-tuning argument persuasive. Given all this, it would seem to fine-tuning skeptics that even conditionalizing on theism, the possible realities forbidding embodied life might very well vastly outnumber the possible realities permitting life. Given that God's preference function for possible realities is inscrutable to them, they say plug is also inscrutable to them. And then the next video that I want to recommend you guys check out is this video from Friction. Does fine-tuning prove a designer? You can look that up, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. I forgot to hit the like button. But yeah, definitely check this out. This is an excellent video, and it offers some criticisms of the fine-tuning argument based on some similar considerations that I have been leveling here. And then the final thing that I want to look at is from Felipe Leon. So Felipe Leon says that there are further independent reasons that might lead one to doubt that cosmic fine-tuning should be chalked up to one or more intelligent fine-tuners. Here I will mention one. Other features of the universe aren't what one would expect on the hypothesis. For one thing, it appears that the vast majority of the observable universe is quite hostile to life. For another, most of the relatively meager number of living things that we know to exist in the universe appear to languish for a significant portion of their lives. For yet another, the members of very many species are hostile to the existence of those of the others. In short, even if the more general phenomena of cosmic fine-tuning might seem surprising on naturalism, but not on theism, the more specific aspects of the life that seems fine-tuned are surprising on theism, but not on naturalism. Accordingly, while the former sort of phenomena might raise the probability of an intelligent foundation, the latter sorts of phenomena appear to deflate it. And he cites Draper here talking about the fallacy of understated evidence. I'm actually going to go through a video later on within this video explaining the fallacy of understated evidence and how it relates to these sorts of arguments.
Let's finish Collins. He likes to simplify it to the following. The probability that we have the evidence for fine-tuning given the naturalistic, I have a typo here, K should be E. No, I'm sorry, K is right. K is the universe.
Right, so the same objections that I just raised are going to be applying to this as well.
Beth, the argument from Collins is really cool. It's the fine-tuning for discoverability. The idea is that of all the possible values fundamental physical constants could assume, there's a tiny range that permit the existence of embodied conscious agents, and we call that the anthropic range. Now, within the anthropic range, there's an even tinier range of values that the physical constants could assume that would make the universe optimal for scientific discovery and investigation. And he calls this the discoverability optimality range. And so an example would be, the universe has relatively low entropy all throughout, but embodied conscious agents need only a relatively small regional pocket of low entropy in order to exist. So the universe doesn't have to have low entropy all throughout for us to exist. Yet the general low entropy of the universe all throughout makes the universe optimal for observational discoveries in astrophysics and cosmology. So examples like that give Collins a new argument, a new kind of fine-tuning argument. Would go like this. The values of certain physical constants fall within the discoverability optimality range within the anthropic range. If naturalism is true, it is enormously improbable that the values of certain physical constants would fall within the discoverability optimality range within the anthropic range. But if theism is true, it's not at all improbable that the values of certain physical constants would fall within this discoverability optimality range. So the values of certain physical constants would fall within this discoverability optimality range within the anthropic range strongly confirms theism over naturalism. The main idea is just being that, look, God didn't just create a universe that was minimally sufficient for our existence. There seem to be features of the universe that are perks, I guess, that they're not just necessary. They're things on top of what's necessary that make it very convenient to do science and to observe the world and so forth.
Yeah, so I haven't researched this particular argument in significant detail. So I'm actually inclined to think that discoverability is evidence for theism, but I guess I'm just not sure how strong that evidence is. Again, we have the Aaron Lucas problem, that we can only look at the epistemically illuminated region, right, that share our law structures and where you vary the constants. But that, of course, leaves us entirely in the dark about the character of the epistemically unilluminated regions where you vary the very law structures themselves. Moreover, we have these potential problems with respect to God would seem to be able to secure the goods of discoverability in conjunction with the goods of conscious embodied moral agents in many other ways. Again, in a kind of Berkeleyan universe, in maybe a simulation universe, within a theistic idealist universe, maybe just in a kind of non-physical heavenly realm, maybe in a completely different kind of universe where it's just fundamental particles, but we have different psychophysical laws, and so on. I guess I'm inclined to think that discoverability is evidence for theism, but because of these various considerations, I don't know how strong the evidence is. The considerations are very, very complex to my mind here, so you start to get really into the weeds, and of course, I don't specialize on fine-tuning arguments, so anyway, on to the next argument.
Okay, and then I've already got this pulled up actually here. Fine-tuning for discoverability. It's in the 24 or so arguments for God that we're just completely one-upping in this stream. So
So the next argument maybe we don't need to infer design at all. Biologists themselves say organisms appear or look designed. Not that we're inferring that they're designed, but that's just how they appear. So some philosophers have argued that if X appears design-like, then X is justifiably taken to be the product of intentional design. Some things in nature do appear designed.
So, firstly, I think premise 1 should be defeasibilized. That is, it should be made defeasible. So if X appears design-like, then X is justified defeasibly, which means it could be overturned or overridden by countervailing considerations. Moreover, arguably, we do have one such defeater in the form of evolution by natural selection. In particular, it's arguably a defeater if you know that there are plausible alternative explanations that don't involve intentional design that nevertheless explain the appearance of design. So then, even if there is an appearance of design, why should you favor the intentional design hypothesis over these alternatives? So this would seem to serve as a kind of undercutting defeater for this defeasible justification for taking it to be a product of intentional design, because now you have a workable alternative hypothesis that accounts for it without intentional design. And so I would take evolution to actually serve as a defeater for this argument, arguably. Moreover, I think that we have, again, parodies on our hands. So if X appears to be incompetently or evilly design-like, then X is justifiably taken to be the product of an incompetent or evil intentional design. Some things in nature, moreover, appear to be incompetently or evilly designed genetic information that is specifically directed to causing, let's say, cancer, or brain tumors, or genetic deformities, or diseases. Or we could talk about things that seem like incompetently designed, like the recurrent laryngeal nerve, and so on, or teleological evil, where basically things are designed to rip each other to shreds and cause immense suffering in other animals. So we can conclude from this that some things in nature are justifiably taken to be the product of incompetent or evil intentional design. But if God exists, right, God is the designer of those things, and so they are not the product of incompetent or evil intentional design, right, since God is not at all incompetent or evil. And so we can conclude that it's justifiably taken to be the case that God doesn't exist. So given this parody, we have a new argument for atheism on our hands.
So they're justifiably taken to be the products of design. And so you have Richard Dawkins famously opening his book, The Blind Watchmaker, by defining biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed. And you have Crick saying that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see is not designed, but rather evolved. If you take the principle that, look, if how something appears is evidence of how it is, these things in nature appear designed, so that's evidence that they are designed. And you could run an argument from design in biology or from the cosmos in general with this sort of reasoning.
All right, and there you go, some resources on that one.